Hello.
Jim, I think we're live.
I think we are. Good evening or good morning, depending on where you may be. I'll introduce Katinka. Katinka, would you like to say a few words about yourself?
Yeah, of course. So I'm a senior lecturer at the criminology department at the University of New South Wales, and I'm also a visiting fellow at the drugs policy modeling program at the University of sorry, I'm saying completely wrong. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of New England and a visiting fellow at the University of New South Wales. Seriously, you can just tell that I've just woken up starting this conference. My apologies. And I'm also editor-in-chief of Performance Enhancement and Health, and I'm the director of the Human Enhancement Drugs Network. And I do a lot of research in relation to the use and supply of enhancement drugs and its regulation. And often, my main focus is focusing on anabolic steroids and I do a lot of work in relation to harm reduction as well. So that is a little bit about me. Jim, back to you.
Yep, thank you. This is where I get everything wrong about me as well now. My name's Jim McVeigh. I'm a Professor of Substance Use and Associated Behaviours at Manchester Metropolitan University. And while I've got an interest in drugs in all their forms, a main area of research has been around human enhancement drugs, and in particular, anabolic steroid use. With a number of colleagues and associates, we formed the Anabolic Steroids UK network, which is bringing together practitioners, academics, and users with a commitment to harm reduction together in the UK. I'm involved in the Harm Reduction Journal, which again is closely linked with this Constellations event. And I'm really pleased to be here and what I hope will be a very interesting hour and a half.
Yeah, me too.
So we've got a number of presentations, we've got some audio clips, and then we'll be opening it up to yourselves. But in the meantime, as you're thinking of things during any of the presentations, do put your questions in. Don't wait for them to at the end of the evening or the morning. Put them in, and we'll make sure that we can get them to the panelists when we have a discussion later on. But if there's any housekeeping or anything that you want to cover, or are we okay to make a start?
I think we're okay to make a start. Just to reiterate is that we will do the presentations and there will be time for questions at the end. So we don't do the questions after each presentation, but we'll make sure to let you know when it exactly is. And then on my end, there's nothing else. And I think we can start with you, Jim.
Okay, if I could have my slides up, please. I'm just going to talk for the next 10 minutes or so. And I'll give an introduction to the issue of human enhancement drugs from a historical context. And I think it's quite important to give a bit of background to where we're coming. This is, I suppose, quite a new field for many people, in particular within the area of harm reduction. And while Katinka will be talking a little bit more about the terminology and the taxonomy and the meanings behind what we actually mean and what we're trying to capture by the term human enhancement drugs, for just this introduction bit, I suppose I'd describe it as better than well, really. And it's that idea of wanting to surpass or to make bigger, to affect the processes of the mind or body in order to increase in value, beauty, or effectiveness. And that's sort of the very general definition that I work to. The temptation is to sort of think of this in the context of sort of science fiction and the future. And I suppose the key thing to get over is that this isn't anything new. That for each of the, I suppose, red pill, blue pill scenario that within cinema or popular culture. You know, there's Aldous Huxley for everything to do with, say, people surpassing their limits within sci-fi in the modern age. You know, there's Lewis Carroll, and these are all making references to what nowadays we think of as enhancement drugs, taking a substance not for their psychoactive or purely for their psychoactive properties, but, you know, to increase in value. It's also tempting to think of it that this is a product of, you know, over commercialization and that, but it's not. It goes back further than this sort of pill for every ill society that we're in. It goes way beyond that. It goes right the way back to the sort of dawn of realization, and whether you're religious or whether you see this as an interesting work of fiction or not, you can't get away from, you know, the idea of the apple being a cognitive enhancing substance, you know, that ability to make better oneself through the consumption of a substance. Right the way through history of art, you see it portrayed in things like, you know, Lucas Cranach the Elder, this piece here about the fountain of youth, this idea of taking the old, the damaged, the infirm, and returning them to better them well. Or not just in Western civilization. Here, the mythological white hair, you know, making the elixir of life on the moon in Chinese mythology. You know, it's a common thread throughout civilization, really, this desire to surpass one's natural abilities. You know, we can talk about people like Brown Séquard and his work in the late 1800s around the distilling of testicles of animals in this idea of a precursor to anabolic steroids. And there's a famous quote about how he regained all his lost youth and his abilities. Of course, in reality, it's absolute nonsense. The amounts that he was taking wouldn't have had any impact whatsoever. But it's part of that culture, that link between, say, the knowledge that we have of animal husbandry and the idea of the testes, that somehow we can utilize that to make oneself return to a better than well scenario. And we see this in the late 1800s with the whole bandwagon of the patent medicines, the secret remedies, the fakeries, and those cure-alls, and so much to the extent that this was a piece of work commissioned by the British Medical Association. And it was to try and capture what kind of things were being sold, what they contained, what were the harms, and what were the prices. And this was early in the 20th century. And this was at the same point that in the United States, there was what they called a sucker list. It's the precursor to the database, the mail order list of people. In this case, it was for lost manhood, or now it'd be advertisements for erectile dysfunction. But, you know, it was big business. And, you know, this was nearly 100 years ago. So really, this takes us through to, I suppose, the 20th century, as we get into the idea of this mass marketing. And we'll hear from Jen, so I won't talk too much about this, but this idea of, in particular, targeting of women for weight loss products. Stated things like it's a very, you know, scientific process. You know, it is. If you think laxatives and stimulants are a good way to lose weight, you know, it's the way forward. And of course, DMP, and this is something that Jen Germain will talk about a little bit later. And it was a common theme, this targeting and this fat shaming, not just of women, but of men as well. And this was sort of pre-staged what has happened really with mass media in the last 20 odd years. So these are just a number of different adverts. And I'll leave it at this point because it was at this point, 100 years later, when myself and colleagues decided to try and pull together what we understood about the categories of enhancement drugs, and that's where I'll leave it, and I'll ask Katinka to pick it up from there, if that's okay.
Perfect. I'm just gonna quickly share my screen. Okay, great. Just I'm having some difficulties on my end. Sorry about that. So yeah, thank you so much, Jim, for that great introduction to the history of human enhancement drugs. So I'm actually going to talk a little bit about developing a head taxonomy and model. And basically, I just wanted to show you this infographic because this is where Jim ended, and this is basically the categories that Jim and colleagues came up with, doing a lot of research in this area. So I just really, wanted to go over this model and then just discuss a couple of the, issues or criticisms that we received on this model. And we actually want to ask the audience on their opinions as how we potentially could do it different. But anyway, so this is currently, and sorry, I'm pointing to the right because I have two screens open, and for me it's on my right screen. Anyway, so there's 6 categories, with the first one being muscle drugs. So that is, drugs to enhance the appearance and function of skeletal muscle. So think, for example, I guess the most popular or the most, the area on which we do the most research are anabolic steroids, to increase muscle mass, for example. Another category is weight loss drugs. Obviously drugs to enhance weight loss. So think of substances like ephedrine or clenbuterol that are used for weight loss purposes. Then you have image-enhancing drugs. So this is drugs used to enhance the appearance of the skin and hair of a person. So an example is melanotan that is used to darken the skin, for example. We have the sexual enhancers category. So drugs used to enhance sexual function and behavior. A very popular drugs is Viagra, which is used for this purpose. Then we have the cognitive enhancers. So, they are often also referred to as smart drugs, and they are used to enhance cognitive functions, including short-term memories, concentration, and alertness. Popular substances that we are, are quite known are, the use of Ritalin or modafinil, especially within student populations. And then we also have the mood and social behavior enhancers. So that's a drug taken for the purpose of altering and improving one's state of mind and feeling. So an example for this category is the use of beta blockers to, for example, calm your nerves before you start a presentation, which potentially I should have taken to make sure that I set my affiliation right. But, anyway, so I'm just going to discuss some of the criticisms on this model. So this model is a great start to separate between different types of enhancement drugs, but it's not without its issues. So first of all, an issue is that these categories are not mutually exclusive. So for example, coming back to melanotan, this is used for its tanning effects, but it's sometimes also used for sexual properties. So, in that way, it already links to 2 different categories. Then you also have the issue that many enhancement substances may be used for other purposes. So, for example, medical reasons. Think of the use of testosterone to treat hypogonadism. So, simply said, to treat low testosterone levels. Another issue is that not all substances that are traditionally labeled as enhancement drugs fit neatly in the 6 categories. So an example is EPO, which is used to stimulate the number of red blood cells, which then leads to an increase in the oxygen carry capacity of the blood and ultimately delivers more oxygen to the muscle. So this extra oxygen significantly increases the muscle's energy production and can therefore help to improve an individual performance output ability. meaning that there is a higher intensity for a longer duration. So, for this reason, this substance is very popular in elite cycling. But the problem is, therefore, EPO does not actually lead to a growth in muscle. So in that sense, it doesn't really fit neatly in the muscle drugs category, but it also doesn't really fit in any of the other categories. So, where to put this kind of substance. Then there's also the issue with the name image enhancers. As the ultimate goal of, for example, muscle drugs or weight loss drugs is to enhance one's image. So whether that is by increasing muscle mass or losing weight. So should this category potentially be labeled as skin and hair enhancers as opposed to image enhancers? And then we also have, the mood and social enhancers are quite a complex category. So there are different types of mood and social enhancers, but in general, we can divide them into, three subcategories, so to speak. So first, drugs to suppress the effects of adrenaline and to calm the nerves. So I already mentioned that example of, beta blockers. Then we also have the second one is the drugs to suppress pain. So such the use of painkillers, for instance. So, for example, by professional athletes, so they can keep playing despite having an injury. And then finally, we also have drugs to alter an individual's mood. So, for example, someone using SSRI, so an antidepressants to increase energy levels and to improve positive feelings of well-being. But saying this last category, this is more so used for therapeutic reasons than actually for enhancements. So basically, the creation of this category leads to two significant problems. Well, first of all, it may be questioned if there's a true form of enhancing, normal abilities, or that rather involves the use of drugs to return to a healthy or normal mental health. And it also obscures the difference and similarities between mood and social enhancers and other innocent substances. Because, for example, cannabis is sometimes also used to enhance someone's moods. So should therefore these drugs that, normally is more so labeled as a recreational drugs also actually be labeled as an enhancement drugs? Which brings me also to the next, one of the, the bigger criticisms that we have received. So with this model, there's a tendency to focus on the substance itself as opposed to the actual motivations for use. So research, in this area typically is focused on the use of anabolic steroids within bodybuilding communities or cognitive enhancers within student populations. So the issue with focusing on the substance itself is that it tends to create this false binary of enhancement drugs versus recreational drugs, with recreational drugs being a substance such as, cannabis, heroin, ecstasy, and so on. So the argument here is that, enhancement drugs are used for self-improvement, often related to physical appearance or sport performance, whereas recreational drugs is more so used for, pleasurable reasons, such as to have more, energy to be able to party all night. But, if you think about it, the concept of enhancement, the idea that substances can lead to self-improvement can, of course, be applied to, a lot of recreational substances as well. And there is also quite some research showing that various recreational drugs are used for self-improvement. So, for example, research has shown that cannabis is used for relaxation, to aid sleep, to forget about worries, or, stimulants like cocaine is used to increase confidence in social settings, increase energy levels, and sometimes actually is also used for weight loss purposes. So the point here is that many substances can be considered enhancement drugs, including many which are typically associated with recreational drug scenes. So these substances can indeed be used for enhancement purposes, as they bring with them, a variety of personal benefits leading to self-improvement. So the purpose of use of a particular drug is therefore not necessarily mutually exclusive. So one could argue that what is important for understanding enhancement substance use is the motivation for it, as opposed to the substance chosen to achieve the transformation. So why have a model, considering this last point, because basically then, a lot of substances could be classed as enhancement drugs. Well, grouping individual examples together based on similar characteristics is important for understanding the broader class and its component categories, because, for example, can help with drug classification systems driven by policy considerations. So, for example, having guided sentencing, prioritize prevention programs, and educate the public about the risk of drug use. It's useful to have categories to assess and compare patterns of drug use. So, for example, statistics on drug use patterns in the form of prevalence data are used as indicators for establishing the extent and severity of problems, which in turn informs regulatory policies and the allocation of resources of treatment, prevention, and law enforcement. Having categorization is helpful for guiding prescriptions for drug use and also to treat and prevent drug-related harm. So for enhancement drugs to be a useful category, both academically and practically speaking, there should be a recognized similarities across the substances within the category and important differences between the substances labeled as enhancement drugs and those that are not. So, considering the previously meant criticism, we are currently rethinking, that initial model that I showed you at the beginning. And we actually could use your input and insights. So things we are considering, for example, are, should we, move away from focusing on certain substances and purely focusing on motivations for use, and then have broader motivation categories? So, for example, Esky and Williams differentiated between the discourse of transformation, the discourse of healing, and the discourse of productivity. The problem with this is that it can then, include a lot of listed and illicit substances, and that would potentially reduce its practical benefits. So, for example, if we focus, a doctor needs to have detailed information about a substance in order to support that patient. So that's why, for example, it's important to have more detailed information about steroid use, for example. It would also be hard to assess and compare patterns of drug use, which is important to assess the extent of the problem. And although there's overlap in reasons for use, there are also important differences between enhancement drugs and recreational drugs. So, for example, the type of users, consumption patterns, and social and cultural drivers. So another option is that we should make a clearer distinction. So the current model seems to be a bit of a mix of focusing on substances and motivations, and perhaps we should just really make a clear focus on the substance itself. So, for example, we can reclass it as steroids and drugs used in conjunction with steroids, lifestyle drugs, and sport doping. So having, for example, the sport doping category could be useful to include those substances that we initially couldn't include but are used for enhancement purposes. So think, for example, of EPO that could be classed here. But then again, well, steroids is a clear category. Something like, what would lifestyle drugs include? Basically, that can also include any drugs, that is used for lifestyle purposes, which again can also include recreational can also include recreational drugs. Anyway, so it's clear that we, and then one of the last things that we could also do is, for example, leave or add or rename certain categories. So maybe should we include something like substances to counter side effects and so on. But, it is really clearly a work in progress, and we haven't found solutions yet. So that's where we really hope that once we have the question rounds for these presentations, that the audience has lots of inputs for us. And thank you for listening. And I would now like to hand it over to Jennifer, who's going to talk about weight loss drugs specifically.
Thank you, Katinka. Could my slides be shared, please? Thank you. So hi everyone, I'm Jen Germain from the Public Health Institute, Liverpool John Moores University. And a couple of years ago, I completed my PhD, which looked at the female use of unlicensed weight loss drugs. So I'm just going to pull out some of the key parts of that research, thinking about the findings, but also some of the methodological and ethical considerations, and then finish off with some post-PhD reflections. So Jim's already discussed some of the historical use and marketing of enhancement products, and weight loss drugs very much fall into this as well. So societal pressures and individual desire for a certain figure is nothing new. And weight loss drugs to help with this have been widely advertised and used from the early 1900s. So newspaper adverts at that time often targeted women and really played on women's insecurities. So they had headlines referring to women as being too fat, or implying that without losing weight, it'd be impossible for a woman to get a husband or be happy. But as harms with these drugs were identified and medicines generally became more regulated, the advertising of weight loss drugs was prohibited. But if we fast forward to the current day, we see that very little has changed. So marketing has got more sophisticated and more globalized due to the advent of the internet. But the strategies used to make people feel like they're not good enough without conforming to an idealized body are the same. There's also increasing pressures on both women and men to look a certain way, which has been exacerbated through both the media and social media and the widespread sharing of often unattainable bodies and lives. And alongside this, we've seen an increase in interest in weight loss drugs. So in particular, we've seen a re-emergence of 2,4-dimethyltrophanol, or DMP, which was one of the drugs advertised in the early 1900s. And DMP was developed in the 19th century and primarily used in making explosives. However, it was also found to increase metabolic rate, resulting in weight loss. So whilst DMP is currently still used in some pesticides, in 1938 it was withdrawn from the consumer market after causing harm in its users. And it's essentially a metabolic poison with side effects including fever, dehydration, vomiting, headaches, and rapid or irregular heartbeat. And the combination of these effects can result in coma and death. And we're also seeing the availability of sibutramine and rimonabant increasing. So if you've gone to your GP prior to 2009-2010 looking for an anti-obesity drug, then you may have been prescribed one of these appetite suppressants. But after sibutramine was linked to increased blood pressure and heart rate, and rimonabant to an increased risk of psychiatric problems, they were both withdrawn from the market. But despite this, all three drugs are still widely available to purchase online. And in terms of harms, DMP in particular, as the most toxic of the three drugs, has been responsible for a number of deaths in recent years, and a high proportion of known DMP poisonings have led to death. So reported and known deaths have been across bodybuilding communities, but also within the general population. So one young woman in particular, who's pictured on the bottom left, Eloise Parry, got a lot of media attention after she died following taking 8 times the recommended dose of DMP. Eloise was only 21 at the time of her death and had suffered from eating disorders for a number of years and was described as having a morbid fear of fatness. The person who sold the drugs, Bernard Rebello, purchased DMP in powder form from China and then sold them online as tablets and was later jailed for 7 years for her manslaughter. Rebello's case argued that he didn't sell DMP as a weight loss drug, but instead as a research chemical, and the website clearly stated that it wasn't for human consumption. Rebello's website is obviously no longer available, but current websites circumnavigate the legal aspects of DMP by saying that they're selling as a pesticide or research chemical, but then still provide information on how to use as a weight loss drug. So what we have is a completely unregulated marketplace that also looks like it has a relatively diverse user group. So back in 2014, a studentship was advertised by Jim, along with some colleagues, which had the title of Exploration of the Female Use of Human Enhancement Drugs. So I had at the time been wanting to start a PhD for a while, was interested in this one, but I didn't know and still don't know much about steroids, which I assumed would be its focus. So I spoke to a few colleagues at the time and was told to play to my strengths. So I started to think about what I found interesting, and for me this was the impact on women to conform to an idealised body and the ways in which women use different methods in order to try and achieve that body. So this led me to come up with a proposal around the online discussion of unlicensed weight loss drugs by women. So I was really lucky to be selected for the PhD and came up with a 4-stage study. So the first was developing a methodology for conducting an online forum analysis. So the method was still fairly new, and I went into it initially quite naively, thinking that I'd just find an online forum, take all the information I needed, and off I'd go. But the approach to identify appropriate online communities needed some thought. So firstly, there isn't one obvious place where people discuss weight loss drugs. Secondly, at the time, there wasn't a lot of research about the users of these drugs, so I couldn't really target specific communities. And thirdly, I was focusing on 3 specific drugs, so needed a search strategy which included both the generic and trade names. I was also looking specifically for UK female users of the drugs, so the search that I conducted needs to take all this into account. So I liken the search strategy that I used to elements of conducting a systematic literature review. So I had set search terms, inclusion-exclusion criteria, set date parameters, and then did assessments of each online community. So I started with around 330 online forums and then whittled this down to 10 for inclusion. And the forums that I selected were quite diverse. So they included bodybuilding forums, but also forums discussing general weight loss and drugs. Following the forum analysis, I also interviewed forum moderators and users of weight loss drugs. And the other element which for me needed a lot of consideration were the ethical implications of online research. And again, I think this is something that I went into quite naively. So there were a lot of concerns from the ethics committees about me taking other people's words without their consent and using their words in research when they'd never been written for that purpose. So understanding all the ethical considerations of online research is quite complicated, and it'll also be different for every study and is interpreted differently by researchers and ethics committees. So I haven't got time to go through all the details, but 4 areas to really think about are whether the online community is public or private and how that space is viewed by those that use it. Should you gain consent from the community members or moderators or both? So one moderator I spoke to who'd been involved in research previously hadn't liked how their forum had been represented, so was really reluctant to engage. Also, what harm could you cause by publishing the words? Is there any risk of identification? And should you consider paraphrasing quotes in order to make them Google proof? Overall here, though, I'd just say it's important to understand the rules of the online community you're engaged with and be respectful of that community. So onto the results. So I've just picked out a few areas of interest and I focused mainly on DMP. So one thing that I looked at was motivation for use. And obviously, of course, motivation to use DMP was tied up with weight loss, but there were some differences. So some users took a whole systems approach to losing weight, posting logs of their progress using DMP, but also their diet and exercise regimes. Others felt that they needed DMP to kickstart their weight loss. Some were overweight or obese and felt that traditional weight loss methods hadn't worked for them. And others were using it to prep for bodybuilding or fitness competitions. Potential side effects put many women off, but others felt that it was worth the risk, with one saying they'd rather be miserable for 20 days than miserable for the rest of their lives. DMP efficacy was equated with weight loss and minimum side effects. And side effects most often discussed were overheating and sweating, but also diarrhea, constipation, hives, and changes to the menstrual cycle. And for many, the weight loss had resulted in them feeling better about themselves, and they felt that it had changed their lives for the better. However, it should also be pointed out that online spaces can be manipulated. So whilst most of the forum moderators that I spoke to seem to genuinely only want to present the best evidence, offer harm reduction, and support other members of the forum, there was one moderator who also sold DMP through another account on the same forum he moderated. And he said that a lot of the time he'd shut down naysayers, not because they're wrong, but because he wanted to make sales. So I heard repeatedly that DMP use would not be admitted to, and especially not by women. And part of this was due to those competing in bodybuilding competitions wanting to seem natural, but also because of the judgment and stigma associated with it. So for women, this was also linked to their role as caregivers, and if something was to go wrong, how would this affect their child? By everyone, though, DMP was viewed as something which should be respected and only used by experts, and there was a real sense that novice users were ruining things for the rest of them. So when discussing high-profile media cases such as Eloise Parry, there were arguments that it wasn't the fault of DMP, she just hadn't known what she was doing. For women across forums, there was a sense that female experiences were limited, and when they did share their experiences, they were criticised. However, they didn't feel that their male counterparts received the same treatment. So the online forums that I looked at fell into two camps, the first being male-dominated environments which offered advice on harm reduction but were dismissive of female voices, and the second more female-dominated but with less experience of using DMP. And as mentioned, it was often seen that women shouldn't use DMP as it's not suitable for them. And for those women who were using or were considering using, other female experiences were scarce, meaning that they were having to rely on dosing regimes based on male users. And this is really dangerous for a drug like DMP, which has been described as playing a game of Russian roulette, and for where the dosing therapeutic window is so narrow. So for some, the view was that women just wanted to be thin and would therefore be reckless using something like DMP, and so should instead be steered towards, as one moderator put it, hippy-dippy herbal shit. So to conclude, my PhD thesis was called One Size Does Not Fit All, and this was because I found that there's no typical weight loss drug user. Both men and women use DMP, their reasons for doing so are complex, and they also have differences in their levels of knowledge, willingness to take risk, perceptions, and perceived effectiveness of the drugs. Therefore, the strategies to greater understand weight loss drug users and reduce harm also need to be diverse and focus on those that are most vulnerable. At the start of the research, I felt that online spaces would be a good way to share harm reduction, but again, this needs to be well thought out because not all moderators have their users' best interest at heart, particularly when they have dual roles as sellers. I borrowed the term cultural manspreading from a paper by April Henning and Jesper Andresen, who were looking more widely at discussion around doping online and argued that the sheer volume of men's voices block out women's, and also that women trying to find other female voices need to wade through male experiences, even on a dedicated female subforum. A moderator that I spoke to said that female online spaces to discuss something like DMP would never work because they become honeypots for men looking to flirt with women online. I don't know about that, but the issue is really for women who do feel pushed out of online communities, where else do they go? Whilst there's no guaranteed safe regimens for any user, women accepting DMP advice in male-dominated forums and based on male norm models can result in potentially fatal consequences. And then finally, I finished my PhD back in 2018 and have since been involved in other research looking to recruit other groups that we could class as hard to reach or hidden, including those who engage in chemsex and opioid users. I spoke about the difficulties in recruiting for all these projects with a colleague, Alice Hillis, who's been involved in most of this work and is also nearing completion on her PhD looking at sex tourism. One common theme across all the studies is that our populations are not always hidden or hard to reach, but instead are actively and consciously hiding. So in particular, some of these groups have mistrust of health professionals and a reluctance to be involved in research. And this made me question some of the decisions I'd made in encroaching on their online safe spaces, which although met ethical standards, perhaps didn't respect their wishes to not be included in research. I also don't think this means we should do nothing in this area. I think certain strategies like patient and public involvement and utilising the skills and knowledge of those with lived experiences are vitally important. So I think I've gone over, so I will stop there and hand back to Katinka and Jim.
Thanks for that, Jen. That was great. It was absolutely fascinating, and I never get sick of hearing it. We have one question through, which picking up on the route that you went down around your methodology. And if you have your time over again, would you use a different approach now?
I don't know if I'd use a different approach, but I think I would have tried to engage forum moderators earlier. I think part of it was being a little bit naive and still viewing these as online public spaces, so I could take the words and use them in research. later on, when it came to then recruit moderators and users on the forum, I really struggled to recruit, and they were very reluctant to be engaged in the research. And that really made me question some of those decisions I'd made in taking those words to begin with. So I think I don't have to necessarily do it differently, but I definitely involve the moderators at an earlier stage.
It's difficult though. I mean, for that 3 years of your PhD saw netnography really mature. I'm not saying you're responsible for that, but I'm just saying during those 3 years, it really came of age, and people started to unpick a lot of the ethical issues. Can you just touch a little bit more on what some of those ethical issues were that you had to wrestle with?
So firstly was the debate around public and private spaces. So private online spaces would be one that you'd need a registration to access. Public would be where you can view all the content without any kind of registration. One of the arguments is that you should only take information from public spaces because they're in the public domain. However, then when you're quoting that within your work, it's quite easy to find the original discussion. It might be linked to a photograph of that person. It might be linked to their real name. So there's a real risk of identification. One of the issues that the Ethics Committee and I thought about a great deal was whether to paraphrase users. So I understood it from the risk of identification and minimizing harm. But my feeling was that normally when you do research, you're involved in the interview, you can ask people to clarify, or the focus group or whatever it is, you can ask people to clarify and you can get that additional meaning. You can also go back to them and check that you've interpreted it or correctly. The issue with this kind of data is you can't really do that, so you're completely reliant on your own interpretation of that data. So for me, I feel like presenting the quote in as much of the original form I can. At least then if someone else comes along and has a different interpretation, they're able to do that without me paraphrasing it to what I think my interpretation should be.
Thanks for that, Jen. Katinka?
Yeah, I think one of the questions for you, Jim, is about, we know that with enhancement drugs that there's a lot of research around steroids and cognitive enhancers. So how can we encourage research in all these other areas, or what is potentially the issues that not research is not done in these other areas? But on the other hand, looking at steroid and research or research on cognitive enhancers, what areas are missing in that area? What kind of research is still needed in those spaces?
I suppose on anabolic steroids, I mean, there's the things that we know quite well, certainly the evidence base around harms. I was going to say the expression, we haven't got a baldy clue, but I don't know if that's a recognised international expression. But what we really don't know is what is effective in relation to minimising harm, in helping to support people who, having used, want to stop using, or even for those people who may be contemplating at a young age, what is effective in delaying the onset of use. We haven't got any evidence base whatsoever around that. And recently completed a piece of work that's summarising research over the past 5 years. And it's virtually all descriptive. And we're starting to understand the various populations and some of their activities, but there isn't a good analytical research being done yet because it's really difficult. But that isn't a reason why we shouldn't be doing it. So that, for me, around anabolic steroids, we need to get out of the sort of the early stages and start doing some real effectiveness evaluations. For cognitive enhancers, I don't think we have got that much good quality research around cognitive enhancement. I think a lot of the research is quite small scale and it's not always very well controlled. So I don't think we know necessarily around many of the things that we take for granted, say, around the area of research for muscular enhancement. I don't think we're anywhere near that stage with cognitive enhancement yet. So I think we're still at the early stages of that. I think the points that you made really well, that perhaps the real key area is us looking at drugs which we may not traditionally think of as enhancement drugs. I'm thinking in particular stimulants. We're going to be hearing about microdosing of psychedelics. We haven't done that work, and I think that for me is fascinating. And the multiple reasons that people use, and it becoming just sort of very quickly quite murky over what people's rationale for use is, and therefore, have we got there yet? It's very difficult to unpick unless people know exactly why they're taking a substance. And if it's because it makes them feel good, it's fine. But we should be honest about that. Is it for either physical enhancement or psychological enhancement, or is it just because it makes you have a good feeling?
Thank you, Jim. There's one question in the chat, Jennifer, addressed to you. I'll read it out loud, and I think then we have to move on to the next part of our session. Anyway, Jay Walker is mentioning that apart from the dodgy sales of slimming substances, so the dark web and the gray area, do women go? He's asking if women also go to legit online pharmacies. Do they get a consultation with an online doctor and be given prescriptions to buy this stuff in the UK from online pharmacies? So not the banned and withdrawn stuff, but the legit stuff that are actually legally prescribed by doctors for weight loss and ADHD.
I'm sure they do. I mean, I think it's very hard at the minute to find a weight loss drug in the UK anyway, which is licensed, because every time one gets licensed, it gets withdrawn from the market again. But yeah, of course it will happen. One of the issues with the pharmacies online, from other work that I've been doing with Marie-Claire Van Hout and also Mark Whitfield, is that quite often it's very difficult to tell which pharmacy is legitimate and which pharmacy isn't. So sometimes even if you think you are doing everything correct and buying from a legitimate pharmacy, you may not be, because they'll take pharmaceutical logos and put them on their website, and everything will look very authentic. So I think for me, that's one of the biggest issues. And one of the issues of the internet in general is that you can quite easily stumble down a rabbit hole that you never intended to go down.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I also would like to add to that, of course, there are medical reasons why people would get a prescription for certain, drugs that are used for weight loss purposes. But that usually will then be, for example, linked to, being obese and having medical issues related to that. So it would be really difficult that if you, for example, are a pretty slim person and you wanted to lose more weight loss, to go to a doctor and convince that doctor to actually prescribe you weight loss substances. And I also want to add that, my research is in steroids, but we actually also see that within steroids, that actually health professionals sometimes will prescribe steroids for image enhancement reasons as opposed to medical reasons. Because, I've done research on the illicit supply and actually looked at court cases where doctors were, convicted for illegally supplying this to patients because it was for enhancement reasons as opposed to medical reasons. So yeah, those kind of things do occur. So thank you for that great question. Jim, I'm just looking at the time. Do we want to move on to the recordings, or did you have a last question that you wanted to address or ask? Oh, Jim, I think you're muted.
I was just doing a goldfish impression. I hope you like it. There was also another comment from Jerry, which is a really interesting point about whether those weight loss drugs are controlled under the Psychoactive Substances Act in the UK, and they're not. It's interesting because while I'm not here sort of banging the drum for the Misuse of Drugs Act, we've got a real issue with, say, DMP, which isn't even classed as a drug. It's a metabolic poison, and as such, there are no levers to control its use. So that's one of the issues around that. When people fall foul of it, as in the case of the death being involved, they can be done for manslaughter, but there's no controls over the substance. And as for those other ones that have been banned, no, they've simply been taken off the list and are completely available on not just on the dark web, but just Googling them, and they're very easy to get hold of. But thanks for raising that.
Okay, well, thank you so much. So I think we should move on to the next session.
Yep.
Which, okay, perfect. So, Maddie, you can just leave myself online. Yeah, thank you so much. So what we've done now, because, one of the issues that we already said is that actually, a lot of these areas are still very unexplored and that we know very little about, but luckily there is some research happening in these kind of spaces. So we've asked researchers that are doing research in relation to, sexual enhancement, microdosing, to actually do a recording with someone who are using these substances and ask 3 questions. So we'll have the questions that they asked were, what are the pleasurable or benefits that you experience from using these substances? What kind of harmful effects have you or seen with others, and how do you think this should be regulated? So we have one that is focused on microdosing and psychedelics, one that is more focused on the use of drugs for sexual enhancement, and one that is also focused on a mix of the use of cognitive enhancers and psychedelics as well. So I'm just going to play these recordings, and after that we'll open up a panel with these aspects with the experts that have actually interviewed these people, and we're opening up the audience can ask questions again. So I'm just gonna share my screen so I can play the recordings. Very interesting. So we're gonna now actually start a panel with including all the people that have presented and who've actually done the recordings. And before we start, I'm just gonna stop sharing my screen. And I also want to highlight, because this recording will be later on online, but just for the people who are listening to this, to the recorded version, I just wanted to highlight that we actually had some pre-recorded audios with people who have used several different types of enhancement drugs, asking questions about potential benefits, potential harms, and how it potentially should be regulated. But unfortunately, because to respect the privacy of these people, these recordings will not be available in the recorded session. Jim, I just gonna hand over to you just to give a bit of background about this panel, and then everyone else can introduce themselves and what their research focus is.
Okay, we're going to open up shortly, so please do send your questions in. I think just by way of introducing people don't know Alex or Demetrius. It'd be nice to just have a few words from yourselves. Alex, do you want to go first? Just tell us a bit about yourself and a bit about your research.
Hiya. So I'm Alex. I'm a PhD student in London, and my background is in sociology and also a bit of criminology, and my research is looking at people's experiences of having sex on drugs, and my main focus is on kind of issues relating to sexual consent, so how people negotiate consent when they're on drugs, how drugs affect people's capacity to consent, and also to kind of critically explore the links between like intoxication and vulnerability, especially in relation to women. Do you want me to talk about my interview as well?
I'm doing it again. Yes, please. It's the short answer.
Yeah, so my interview was the first one, and it was with a 27-year-old non-binary person who pretty regularly uses drugs, quite a wide range of them actually, and also very regularly has sex on drugs too. And something that was interesting about that particular participant as well was that they were also using testosterone. They were like assigned female at birth, kind of came to non-binary identity later on, and was also like when I interviewed them this time, they were now being prescribed testosterone by their GP. But like when I first interviewed them, they were doing it illegally. They were buying it like from like bodybuilding sites, I think. I can't quite remember. So that was quite interesting, and they talked a lot about that alongside kind of more, you know, what we normally see as more recreational drugs like MDMA and acid and stuff like that. So that was very interesting. But yeah, about that interview specifically, I think what was interesting that came out of that was first that they didn't see their use of drugs with sex as super distinct from like their club drug use. And that's partly because nightclubs were one of kind of the key locations where they would have sex. For example, in dark rooms, as they mentioned. And I also thought it was very interesting how a lot of like the harms they discussed didn't really come from the substances themselves, but more from like the context or situations of use. So like, for example, the layout of a club, like there not being access to water or a place to cool off or sit down. And also that point about security staff and bouncers, you know, are they like invested in the safety of the people in the nightclub? You know, including queer people and trans people. So they mentioned that point about, you know, misgendering. You know, are people being, you know, when you go into a nightclub, you're often searched, like what's the gender of the person you're being searched by, and how does that like impact you? Are you being like, this particular person might be put in like the women's queue, but like that's not their identity. So that those are harms as well. Yeah, so are the security staff invested in the welfare of the people who go there, or are they just only bothered about like the license for the venue? And then also those things they talked about in relation to pleasure, you know, they talked about those embodied, the embodied pleasure of taking drugs, but also how that kind of extended beyond them to that community feeling of being part of a queer space where drugs were all entangled in that. But again, like these pleasures can't solely be traced to the substances themselves, just like the harms as well.
That's fascinating. I think it's brilliant the way you described about that sort of blurring of the substances and their uses, and I think really demonstrates that the issue of enhancement drugs shouldn't be left to people who are just rehearsing and researching enhancement drugs. That it's such a wider issue than that, affecting different populations who are using drugs in different ways. I think that's so important. So thanks very much for that. I'll come back to you in a minute. Can I go to you, Demetrius? Do you mind telling us a bit about yourself and just a bit about the background and your research and that interview that you conducted?
Sure. So my name is Dimitris Liokaftos. I'm a sociologist investigating human enhancement and substance use, currently based at the Public Health Institute at Liverpool John Moores University. So my interest in the topic of human enhancement drugs developed out of my work on the historical evolution of bodybuilding culture and the use of image and performance enhancing drugs therein. So following that, I'm currently undertaking a research fellowship funded by the Wellcome Trust, where I look at microdosing psychedelics as a new form of human enhancement. This is a qualitative study taking place in the UK, Germany, and the Netherlands. And I'm doing interviews with both microdosers and stakeholders in the psychedelics field. So my investigation runs on two parallel levels. Firstly, I'm looking at how users of psychedelics experience and approach their microdosing practice. And secondly, I'm looking at how microdosing as a social phenomenon is shaped by and in turn shapes the broader psychedelics renaissance. So the recording that you heard before is from an interview I did with a 33-year-old participant who's been engaged in microdosing psychedelics on a relatively regular basis for the past 4 years. But she's also had experience with macrodosing psychedelics, or in other words, using full doses of psychedelics. I think it's interesting the way she talks about psychedelics being crucial in terms of a broader shift in perspective on her life and her perspective on life. For example, when we were talking in the segment you heard before about the benefits of microdosing, she spoke about essentially developing a different relationship with reality. So I think that's interesting in terms of the conversation we were having before on enhancement. So here, for example, you can see how the specific enhancements offered by microdosing are framed in terms of a broader project of the self. And I think it's also interesting to see both in my own segment, but the ones that we heard from the other researchers, the kind of vocabularies and concepts that are used by our respondents that in a way combine, on the one hand, a technical language, but also a language of popularized psychology and spirituality on the other hand. For example, things like being present in the moment, or silencing the inner critic, or reacting to what is in front of you rather than out of the stories that people have inbuilt regarding themselves, looking at reality through a new lens. Things like that, which I think are quite interesting. Just one last thing, I think, again, that was also brought up in all three interviews that we heard, is, again, that's interplay between the individual and the kind of self-work that they do in relation to the substance use, but also kind of a broader, excuse me, more communal culture that they seem to be referencing all the time. The one that will be able to support that particular type of substance use. I'll stop here, but we can discuss any of that if you want further on.
That's great, thanks. If I can just sneak in one follow-on question, if you don't mind. I mean, before you started working in this particular area, as you said, you're interested in bodybuilding. You were involved in a very influential piece of work about typologies. Do you see the learning that you gained during that research at looking at typologies of anabolic steroid users, is that something that you can apply to this group? You know, within, I mean, to me, it's not my area of work. I don't know the depth of the layers in there. Is it something that you would apply to this group as well?
I'm beginning to experiment with this idea. I think it's quite early in terms of my data collection to be able to say if it will pan out, but I have this kind of, when I'm approaching my interviews, I have this in the back of my mind that at the end of this, I might see some sort of typology developing in terms of kind of being able to group users according to their different motivations or the ways that they approach risk and benefit. So that's an open question, I think. But there are certainly some promising data suggesting that we could be having a typology, different kinds of people. But again, like in the case of steroids, these typologies seem to be true for one particular moment in time or for a particular cultural or social setting, but they could be developing, especially as phenomena develop, and microdosing psychedelics in particular is a very new and fast developing thing. So it remains to be seen.
Thanks. I'll butt out and pass over to you, Katinka, and I'll keep quiet now.
Well, we have one last panel member that, of course, has already introduced herself. But Jen, could you just, reiterate what your research was about, and maybe potentially reflect on the recordings?
Of course. So my research explored the female use of unlicensed weight loss drugs. I found that women do use these drugs, but struggle to find a place to share experiences and get advice. And I also argue against being a typical weight loss drug user, and that's in terms of motivation, knowledge, experience, and willingness to take risk. And I found the audio and some of the discussion really interesting, and the idea of drugs that you wouldn't typically think of as being used for enhancement, but people are saying that that's, part of why they use them. And it got me thinking, Jim, about another piece of research that we were involved in, looking at the use of pre-exposure prophylaxis, or PrEP, which is obviously used to prevent the risk of transmission of HIV. But a lot of the participants that we spoke to described how it actually enhanced their sexual experiences because they felt safe. They felt that they could enjoy sex more easily because they didn't have this worry of HIV lingering in the background. So yeah, I found that really fascinating. It just feels that you could almost bring the idea of enhancement into almost every drug type that you look at in some way or another.
Thank you so much, Jen. I want to reiterate to the audience that this panel is open to the audience, so please post your questions if you have any. In the meantime, I was just really curious because this was really interesting to, to listen to and to actually hear, about substances that we potentially typically don't think of when we're thinking about enhancement drugs and the different, reasons for using them, and also actually that gray area of between therapeutic use, and enhancement drug use. So thinking back about the presentation that I gave about, the current model and how we potentially should think about changing that, I was just wondering whether, any of you had some ideas about this model and potentially, what we could do to change it based on the experience you have with your research.
Did you ask about the model that you presented in the beginning? At the beginning,
yeah, and how we potentially could do that differently.
It's a tough one, I think. It's really tough whether to pursue it down the line of individual substances or in terms of motivations, because you have the extra issue there of what we define as healthy or normal human functioning. That's not set in stone. That changes over time and in different societies. So it's hard, even if we wanted to reach, I think, a kind of very clear distinction there. I mean, Jim gave a very interesting presentation about the historical development of some of these things. And if we go back to the history of bodybuilding as well, we can see that, the use of anabolic steroids in particular goes hand in hand with a shifting idea of what it means to have a normal or natural body. So we doing the research, we're kind of in the midst of it. I don't have any solutions or any conclusions. I'm just saying that I think the more we research the area, the more we realize how unstable some of these categories are.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. I fully agree with that. Alex or Jennifer, did you want to add anything to that?
I don't think anything else beyond what I've already said, that it feels that you could include pretty much everything. So maybe it is better to look at the experiences rather than drug use themselves, but it's difficult. You need to draw the line somewhere, need to make that distinction somewhere. So yeah, sorry, that hasn't helped at all.
No worries. Alex, did you want to add anything to that? And otherwise I'm handing over to Jim.
Yeah, sure. Like maybe briefly, I thought the point Dimitri just made was so good, and something that I've kind of encountered in thinking about drugs and sexual enhancement, because kind of classic sexual enhancing drugs, like for example Viagra, is really like seen to kind of restore like normal sexual functioning, but then which can be problematic for people whose like default sexual functioning isn't that way. So then is it something that needs to be fixed, or like is it a problem? Why are we defining it as a problem necessarily? Yeah, and it's interesting because then when you're thinking about other drugs in relation to sexual enhancement, like for example MDMA, people like my participants who like, not necessarily men, but my participants who like had penises would often talk about how like MDMA was like something like an obstacle to getting an erection, but then still talked about the sex as being like extremely enhanced in other ways and just very different. So like it's just, yeah, what does enhancement even mean? And myself and like some colleagues wrote a paper for a special issue of the International Journal of Drug Policy on enhancement, on the theme of enhancement, and it was called it's called pharmacosex and like rethinking enhancement in the context of sex and drugs, and we like make the case for kind of going beyond these like biomedical definitions of what enhancement is to include things around like emotional connections with partners and stuff like that as well. But yeah, that's not that was not like ideas for what you answered, but just kind of some thoughts I had. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Very, very interesting and very, very helpful as well. Jem, I'm handing over to you. There are some questions from the audience. Do you want to ask those, or do you want me to?
You go ahead. That's fine.
Yeah. Okay. So we have one question. I think Dimitris, I think it's more geared to you. Nick is mentioning, different kind of substances that are used for different kind of purposes. But basically, the main question is, what is mostly being microdosed and what for?
Mm-hmm. I think the substances that are most typically microdosed are magic mushrooms and LSD, to the best of my knowledge. And what was the rest of the question?
And for what reasons are these substances being microdosed mainly?
Yeah, right. So I think we could broadly divide them into different categories. The one being enhancement, even though that's a very broad term. So people use microdosing psychedelics to enhance cognitive ability, to enhance creativity, to enhance flow, to be better at dealing with technical or technological tasks, to feel better, be in a better mood. So it's a really vast array that comes under the umbrella term of enhancement. And on the other hand, you have people microdosing, like we heard in one of the other interviews, for therapeutic reasons, to treat things such as depression, anxiety, PTSD, attention deficit disorder. So there's a whole range of motivations that people are nowadays using microdosing for.
Thank you so much. I also realized that we are nearing the end of our session. So, Jim, I just wanted to hand over to you to see if there's any last remarks or questions that you wanted to ask. Otherwise, we unfortunately have to end this amazing session.
All right, I'll get the last word in. Really, it was. I think that there's a purpose for having the categories, and I think they do serve their purpose for the likes of policymakers. I think the conversations today have underlined the fact that wherever possible, we need to get away from them and simply ask people, why are you using it? What are the risks that concern you? What support mechanisms? And find out and have that dialogue, and keep as many of those sort of false corralling of drugs away from the people that matter as much as possible, and keep them for the policymakers where you need to. But otherwise, I think it's just about people using drugs, really.
Thank you so much for these amazing concluding remarks. I want to also thank everyone that has given a presentation for today and for this really interesting panel. I wish we had longer, but we don't have any. We're out of time. We're already over time a little bit. So thank you so much. And I wish everyone a good evening, sleep well, have a nice start of your day. And I'm looking forward to the panel tomorrow, which is specifically focused on steroids. So if you're interested in enhancement drugs, make sure to tune in for that panel as well. So thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.